大家晚上好，欢迎大家回到国际培训大咖五十谈。今天是2021年3月3日，正月20，在这里给大家拜个晚年。之所以欢迎大家回到国际培训大咖五十谈，是因为本档节目呢暂停了2周，因为是这个春节的原因。那么在春节期间呢，我们给大家举办了另外一场非常有意思的，也是影响力非常之大的节目呢，叫做国际培训大咖五十谈新春特辑。从正月11到正月16，我们连续访谈了国内著名的企业大学、国内比较顶尖的优秀的企业大学负责人，以及企业的培训和学习发展的负责人，让他们来介绍他们成功的经验啊，在人才发展、人才管理和培养人才等等方面成功的经验。那么在这16期当中呢，大家非常的参与者呢非常的踊跃啊，一共有将近2万人次观看了这16期的节目，而且呢复看的节目呢还在增多，所有的节目呢都在钉钉上面保存至少1年的时间供大家观看。所以呢，到明年春节之前，大家都是可以观看的，而且是 free 的。那么在这16期期间呢，首先呢，感谢所有的嘉宾们的亲情分享，那么同时呢，也感谢所有的观众们的支持。那么本周呢，而且呢，在第16期结束的时候呢，我们也同时宣布了国际培训大咖五十谈的同档的节目啊，叫做中国培训大咖五十谈项目的启动。那么这春节期间的新春特辑呢，是这中国培训大咖五十谈的前一部分。那么后面的话呢，我们再会延展，继续访谈中国比较顶尖的、非常优秀的企业的人才发展的负责人，把中国的由改革开放40年以来优秀企业的人才培养和人才发展的优秀经验呢，也向国外去介绍。那么国际培训大咖五十谈以及中国培训大咖五十谈这2档节目呢，我们争取呢能够把国外的优秀的经验介绍到中国来，同时呢把中国的优秀的做法介绍到国外去，这样互通有无，互相取长补短，介绍经验，那么互相学习，目的只为一个，就是能够让企业的学习和发展的管理者们，让企业能够更高效的、更快的、更好的培养更加合格的人才，为企业的发展服务。今天晚上呢，我们是恢复播出暂停2周以后的恢复播出是第40期。那么上一期呢是第39期，39期呢我们访谈了美国在华人当中非常著名的 Dr. Ross Tsai。那么 Dr. Ross Tsai 他本名呢叫蔡本宏博士，他也是我的一位老朋友，30多年的老朋友。他之所以在美国非常有名，他是一位非常有名的学习发展的专家，而且呢在多家的500强公司里面呢一直担任培训的经理、培训总监、培训首席学习官。那么现在呢，他是财富500强的一家公司叫 Thrivent 的首席人才官，而且呢是这个负责整个集团的人才发展的工作。那么在上一期的访谈当中呢，我也是他的粉丝之一他也是我的这个大姐大那么在上一期的访谈当中呢，我们向他学习了很多的这个知识特别请教了领导力方面的一些个知识，特别呢还问他了还向他询问了培训如何在企业里面起更多的作用，以及呢中美2国之间在人才发展方面的一些个差异和这个相同点和不同点等等。所以呢收获非常之大，从他的特别的视角呢给我们诠释了很多过去我们没有看到的一些东西。那么最后的话呢，我们也借用了在这个美国新任总统拜登在就职典礼上那个年轻桂冠诗人叫做 Amanda Gorman 的诗叫做光明永在，只要我们能够有足够的勇气去寻找光明永在，只要我们有足够的勇气去成为光明For light will always be there if we're bold enough to find them, and to find them. For there will always light if we are bold enough to be it. 所以呢，也是非常的令人鼓舞在这里再次感谢蔡本宏博士几十年以来在本领域的贡献，同时呢，也为很多的在美的在国外的打拼的华人的学生学者们树立的榜样。 希望以后有机会能够向您学习更多。那么今天晚上我们请到了第40期啊，我们请到另外一位嘉宾，他也是非常重量级的嘉宾，他的名字叫 Dr. Clark Quinn， 叫克拉克·奎恩博士。他是美国非常著名的学习与发展的专家，特别是在国际特别是在学习的这个战略以及这个叫做绩效啊，学习知识以及这个问题解决啊，帮助企业去具体的解决问题等等方面呢，系统化的研究方面呢有非常系统的建树。那么本期的话呢，我们特别着重的去向他学习呢，关于 M learning 叫移动学习方面的一些个基本的问题。那么移动学习到底它有什么样的特点呢？它能够产生什么样的价值呢？移动学习我们怎么样去做呢？怎么样避免这种垃圾进垃圾出的这种状况？就是说让移动学习更加的有效呢？同时，更加重要的是，我们将要询问他一本书里提到的一些个 myth， 就是一些个比较常见的培训和学习或者学习发展方面的一些个误区等等。所以呢，这一期的话呢，将会与以前的话呢的一些个观点呢，会有一些个不同，甚至是颠覆。请大家呢多来讨论，多来观看，多来学习，多来互相的这个交流。好，那么下面我们闲话少叙，我们就隆重请出 Dr. Clark Quinn 奎恩博士。Hi, Clark. How are you?
I'm fine. How about yourself?
I'm good. Thank you, Dr. Quinn. Let me formally address you at least once, Dr. Quinn. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to be on the Training Masters series.
Well, I'm honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
And tell us where you're located. You're based in California?
I am. I'm in a place called Walnut Creek, California, which is in the larger San Francisco Bay Area, but it's a bit inland on some major transportation channels, but it's a little bit quieter, a little bit calmer.
So it's near the Bay Area, is near San Francisco. And so we have a lot in common. Both you and I served at different times at the IBSTPI board. Just for our audience, previously we mentioned that with Dr. Fernando Siniol, that it stands for International Board of Standards for Training, Performance, and Instruction. The IBSTPI.org is one of the competency and standard setting authoritative organizations in the world for learning and development. So, and Dr. Quinn is a current board member. So we have a lot in common, but not everybody knows you. So Dr. Quinn, well, can I just address you as Clark, right?
Please.
Thank you. And for our audience, will you please introduce yourself? Tell us where you grew up, where you went to college, what you studied, and tell us where you work and live now. Thank you.
Okay. So I grew up in California. I'm a native Californian, which is sometimes rare, in a little town called San Pedro, which is the Los Angeles Harbor area. It was kind of a diverse area, which was really nice to have that broader exposure. I went to school at UC San Diego for marine biology, but it turns out there wasn't a connection there, and it was a bunch of rote memorization. So I was taking some computer science and tutoring for the office that did tutoring for some extra money on campus. And I got a job doing the computer support for the office that did the tutoring, and a light went on. I said, computers supporting learning. We didn't have a program in it, but they had a program where you could design your own major. I designed my own major in computer-based education. It's been my career ever since. Now, my first job out of school was designing and programming educational computer games, and I realized we didn't know enough. So I went back to UCSD to get a PhD in what was effectively applied cognitive science. And that led me on a strange trajectory. I ended up doing an academic route for a while, teaching at the University of New South Wales, came back to the US to join a startup that of course collapsed in 2001 like so much else. And I've been a consultant since then. Out of here in Walnut Creek, I run a boutique consultancy that's basically just me, Quinnovation. And I help organizations apply what we know about how we think, work, and learn to the design of solutions.
Great, thank you, thank you. The Bay Area is so close to everybody's heart because almost everybody has a relative over there in around the San Francisco area. So you probably have some see a lot of Chinese restaurants and Chinese atmosphere there. So it's really diverse area. So Clark, you are an expert in e-learning, and China has come a short way or a long way in e-learning. And you have published a couple books, and also I remember you told me that you spoke in China back in 2018. Was that true?
I think I have spoken in China 3 times. I spoke
Mhm.
in Shenzhen and then in Beijing and finally in Shanghai. Each were separate trips. I don't remember the exact years at which it was. I mean, apologies. But twice were on mobile learning, and because those were topics of 2 of my books.
Yeah, you published a couple books on e-learning and learning engagement and learning strategy and learning delivery all around learning development. But M-learning, mobile learning is one of your the main research and practice area. So you're an expert in that area, and you're so well known in the industry for mobile learning. And but China has come a long way, or short way, during the past 20 years. Let me give you a little bit background. During the year 2000, just around, still remember Y2K, you know, that at that time, the end of the beginning of the millennium, and that was the beginning of the explosion of the internet bubbles. So at that time, you know, in America, the e-learning just started. You know, LMS, the birth of LMS, LCMS, even the word e-learning is co-authored or co-created by, you know, Mark Rosenberg, by many people, by many like Elliot Macy, a lot of big
Jay
names.
Cross,
And
really.
right. And and then China started to import this concept at that time. So e-learning started to become very popular, but not very, and then it died down. And then mobile learning, a cell phone started to get very close and very popular, and then started to adopt mobile learning. So mobile learning is still on the rise, still new to China. And a lot of, especially during the pandemic last year, started again, you know, the pandemic pushed everybody back to online. And so I want to, first question I want to ask you about, you have been researching on this for a long time. What is your definition of M-learning?
Well, for one thing, it's any meeting any learning or performance or information need through a mobile device. And you have to be careful what's a mobile device. In China, it's your phone for sure. But many places here, as you point out, we started with e-learning and laptops, really before we started getting these mobile platforms. We had flip phones, but they weren't really digital platforms like the current mobile phones are. So a lot of people thought, well, a laptop could be mobile learning. And that's why I want to be very clear. To me, mobile learning is with a device that you can use naturally while standing or walking,
Mm-hmm.
because that's more the condition that separates it out from just, you know, a tablet is really
Mm-hmm.
just sort, and particularly a laptop is just a desktop that you can move around. If you can use it naturally while you're standing or walking, that's a mobile device, and using that to meet needs. Now, I want to be really clear about one thing. For
Mm-hmm.
me, and this changes in the context of China, but here in the US,
Right.
M-learning is not courses on a phone. When you ask, I would ask audiences, you know, how do you use your phone to make yourself smarter? And people tell me tales about using it to navigate, using it to look up information, using the calendar, taking pictures so they remember their parking space at the airport, a lot of things. And so they list thing after thing after thing. And then I stop and I say, okay, how much of that was a course? How
Mm-hmm.
much of that was a class? And none of it is, right? And so I say that's the power of these platforms, but we use them for many ways to augment our brains.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, and yet that's here in the US. And in China, where the phone is your digital device, it has to be your learning platform as well. I really like what I like about mobile. With the typical pattern that Palm found out. You remember the Palm Pilot when it first came out?
Oh
It was
yeah.
sort of
Oh,
the
the
first,
PDAs.
right. It was the first successful, mobile device. Before that, the Apple had that. I'm drawing a blank on it, but it didn't work because couldn't recognize handwriting and it didn't work. So the Pilot was the first successful one. And afterwards, they tracked how people used it. And unlike a laptop, which you sit down for a few times a day, but for long periods of time, like 20 minutes, your mobile device, you picked it up, used it just briefly and put it away, but you used it many times a day. And that's not the typical pattern for learning. For learning, you tend, you need to sit and focus for a long time. You can do little bursts, but you kind of need an initial start. So I think about mobile as in 4 ways: augmenting formal learning, although in China, it can make sense that you get your initial content and then you do little bits over time. I also think about performance support. That just use it in the moment, to me, is really what matches mobile's natural niche. I think of performance support helping you just in the moment accomplish something.
Right.
A third one is social, interacting with other people. And by the way, none of those are unique to mobile devices. The one that is unique to mobile devices that I think is the fourth area and the biggest opportunity is contextual, doing something because of when and where you are. And we say that in China with all the, QR codes aren't big here, but I
Oh.
noticed that they're big in China.
Oh
And
yeah.
being able to snap that and just get something because of where you are, or because you saw something go by, is a fabulous opportunity that mobile can do that really you can't do with other devices.
Right, right, right. All these 4 points is a really, really classic. I should say their applications. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the first one, the augmentation of
Augmenting formal learning,
yeah,
sure. So,
augmenting.
you could attend a course where they presented some initial content
Right.
and they gave you some examples and they gave you a little bit of practice. And you could do that on the phone too, but that's going to take an extended period of time. That might take 20, 30, 40 minutes of sitting still and consuming this, or it could be in a workshop. But then we know it doesn't stick. We know that our learning atrophies really quickly. So we need to reactivate it over time. And mobile's wonderful for that. You can find opportunistic moments and just say, oh, you're not doing anything here. Let's reactivate that knowledge. And back to that contextual stuff, you can film yourself performing and share it with other people so that they can provide critique if it's some interpersonal skill. You can, because of some place you are that's related to your learning, it might trigger something specific and say, by the way, you're interested in architecture. It so happens that that building you're right next to is an example of this type of architecture. So it's about extending the experience. It's about reactivating. It's about interleaving, and it's about taking advantage of context. That to me is what mobile does supremely well.
Right, right, right. This is great. This is great. I mean, the four, what shall I call it? The four characteristics of e-learning or of mobile learning.
And that's my failure as a business person instead of as a consultant. I haven't really branded it. I should. I sort of think of the four modes of mobile learning, or the four phases
Right,
of mobile learning.
right.
So I really should come up with a clever phrasing. You're welcome to coin one and throw it back to me.
Well, thank you. As I see it, it really is. They really are the four major characteristics of mobile learning, because mobile learning is kind of a branch out from e-learning or tech. Well, for at the very beginning, it was called like technology-based learning, like the umbrella, and then technology-enabled learning, and then was called. It comes a long way. It called like the CD-ROM based learning, the laser disc, based learning. If you remember those elsewhere, I had Michael Allen on my show. Also, I interviewed him elsewhere era, and then we had the CBT, computer-based learning, or and then WBT, the web-based learning, and then we have IBT, intranet based learning, and
Mm.
then we have you learning, I learn. You is ubiquitous learning, and then I
Mm.
learning. So all these words, like they're kind of a little bit flashy, but do you think that I'm learning is comes here is to come here to stay?
Well, yes, because so my focus is not on the technology. My focus is how do we take how our brains naturally learn and how do we augment with that technology? So I think mobile is a having digital platforms. So you think about, many people tend to think about mobile as a tactic. Okay, we're going to put this thing on a phone. And as soon as
Hmm.
you do, people start thinking of the mobile device as a platform, just like your computer is a platform for doing lots of different things. And so you have to strategically think that way up front. But having a platform that not only brings that capability wherever and whenever you are, but can now has so many sensors, it knows a lot about where you are, and it can do things because of that. That capability isn't going away. That's wonderful. And going back to how our brains work, being able to trigger stuff contextually, and again, that spacing means absolutely M-learning is here to stay. There's an interesting project going on at the Advanced Distributed Learning Initiative from the Department of Defense in the US, and they're talking about the total learning architecture.
Hmm.
So the proposition is if we can create appropriate standards for data interchange, our
Hmm.
learning experiences can be distributed across our desktop, our laptop, our mobile, our tablet, our watch, our glasses, whatever digital devices we have, and our interactions with people as well.
Hmm.
So that to me is the trigger to say, yes, mobile learning is going to go away, but it really is becoming that ubiquitous learning. It's
Hmm.
learning that's distributed around us through the technology environment we're in, as opposed to device specific delivery. Now, if your device is only a phone, that
Yeah.
will be your ubiquitous environment, right?
Right.
And for many people, that's it. That's the way they access the digital world is through their phone.
Right. We're living we're fortunate enough to live in this. This is the as Balzac said, this is the worst of times. This is the best of times. This is probably on the positive side. We are seeing the advances of technology. Uh, I mean, they're advancing like so fast. It's several years another generation, several years another generation comes out, and then the most popular thing a few years ago just fade away in our lives. So, what do you think in the future? I'm imagining that in the future even cell phones will disappear. Is cell phones will disappear, so we probably will need to redefine e-learning. I mean, I'm learning.
Mhm. Well, I'm not convinced. We will
Mm,
need an interface. I do not want an implant. And I
mhm,
think
mhm.
implants are implausible because the way our brains work are it's not like we have a node for this and a node for that and a direct interface. It's
Right.
distributed activation across our entire brain. All of our neurons may
Mm,
be on or off. And to effectively interact with our brains, you'd have to have that sort of ability to enact our every neuron. And
mm.
I don't trust anybody to do that well. I worry about, what would they do while as long as they're messing in there. And it's not necessary. We have fabulous mechanisms to trigger those patterns. They're called words and images,
Right.
language. So
Right.
what we need are things that can do that. Now it might be in glasses and earpieces, so we don't need to actually have something in our hands. We may augment it and display it, but we're going to have mobile digital technology with us. And
Mhm.
so I what I try to do in the mobile books and in my game book and in the other one is focus on the principles that are aligned with how our brains work so that whatever the technology changes are, the principles are still accurate and appropriate and give us good guidance for design. And that's what I think is going to matter.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so we will have a mobile digital capability with us, whether it's a phone or
Mhm.
whether it's, earpiece and gesture based and eyes so that, we just sort of are talking to ourselves. We're already doing that, talking to ourselves, walking down the street, right? But we'll be just doing it in space and we won't obviously be carrying any technology, but it'll
Right.
be there in some way.
Right. just like all those sci-fi movies, like they have like a screen, like a lights, like they have borders, and lights have borders, right? The
Mhm.
projection comes up there, and then they can make it, and they can just do the scrolling and scratching all the time so easily, right? So the mobile
Right.
device will be replaced by newer technologies. Probably we don't know yet, but they're
Mhm.
they're being made. So whatever technology where that's just a method of delivery, right? Just a kind of a tangible carrier of the message. So the content is king. Content is king, as you said in one of your books. And I use just if you know, let you know that we use it here too. I especially in my instructional design classes, I use it all the time. Content is king. So on a 30,000 feet level, how do we get the right content to the right people at the right time at the right place?
Well, it's really interesting because the corollary to content is king is that context is emperor. And so, in your phrase, the right person or the right people at the right time and the right place
Hmm.
is the context. How do we do this? Well, I've been an advocate for a number of years now, actually since 2000 when we built a system that started doing this on breaking content up. What we too often do with e-learning and maybe even with m-learning is we hardwire an experience together. So we say this, you're going to see this, you see this. If you use an authoring tool, that's what you do. And yet, I don't think that's the right way to do it. I think you want to have content that you access not by wire, but by description. And you pull up and you say, I want the video about fixing a washing machine that's small enough to fit on this device. And then the database pulls it up by that description and finds what you want. And the sequencing of that is again done by rules. This is what happens with web marketing. You go to presumably Alibaba works similar to Amazon here in that you go there, but there's recommendations for other stuff.
Oh yeah.
You like this, you see this. There's nobody watching what you're doing and putting that together by hand for you. It's all being done by rules and pulling together from content databases. That's the future of learning. And so the way we do that is we're going to have models. We're going to
Mhm.
have models of the learner. What do they know? What do they need to know? Where are they in this trajectory? We need models of the content with those descriptions. What's a video? What format is it in? What is it about? At what stage of difficulty is it? And what role are you playing? And then we need models of the context of what you're doing now, what your responsibility is, and what you're trying to achieve. And then we can still, and that's how we bring in that right content. We need to develop our content differently. We need to build these models and we need to write the rules. And it can be done by machine learning as well if you have a good enough database. But in 2000, I was leading a project developing an adaptive learning platform. And we were going to have initial rules that were based on what the best cognitive science said about how to learn. And then we were going to machine learn in the background and improve those rules by looking at what actually worked and didn't. So it can be a hybrid system. But what you want is to start separating out content from the description and start pulling it together by best principles. And that way you can start doing personalization, you could start doing adaptive learning and delivering on the right device at the right time. It was Wayne Hodgins who used to talk about the right stuff. As you say, the right content for the right person at the right time in the right place on the right device, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Um,
For the right result.
yes, exactly. Good point.
Yes, it is. Yeah, content is king, and context is the emperor, and of course, the emperor is much bigger. I love that. I love that. I love that phrase because it does give us some put all our work into perspective. So all we do is we're in the organizational environment. We're at the company. We work for this company. So I'm an employee. So all I do is for the performance results, and it really fits into the augmenting the performance support and social interaction and contextual the four characteristics of I'm learning. I'm looping back to what you just talked about. It's really, it is very important. So what are the key, my next question is, so if content is king and context is the emperor, so what are the key aspects of designing a good I'm learning program? Because you have such a big book on designing it. This is a simple question, but I do wanna ask you this question because I give us like a 30,000 feet overview.
Well, sure. And, again, an M-learning program is one that meets the needs, that achieves the right results in the right way. If you
Mhm,
just need to do this and it's not very frequent that you have to do it, trying to
mhm,
make a course about it is crazy. To make it just performance support so you can achieve the goal is a better solution than trying to get it in the head. Don't put it in the head unless it absolutely positively has to be in the head, and then you do it. So I
mhm,
say, you know, access social first. If the answer's in the network, your job is done. Then put it in the world if you can, and only put it in the head at the last moment. Then if it has to go in the head, so if we're talking about now an learning program, it first starts with what makes a good learning program. It's got to have concepts,
mhm,
models that guide, help you make the inferences about what will happen so you can make good decisions. It's got to have good examples so you can see how it plays out in context. And then it's got to have meaningful practice. So that's critical. It helps if you make it emotionally engaging, motivate the person up front so they know why this is important. All that's independent of mobile. So what does mobile give us? Well, it should be minimal. That's true. We learned that for mobile. It was critical for mobile because we had small screens and limited time and bandwidth issues. And yet we found out that works better. Don't give everything, back to the content issue. A whole bunch of content isn't necessarily going to lead to behavior. If you minimize that and give practice and support it and scaffold it, what mobile can do to make a good M-learning program is then reactivate it. And ideally, we reactivate knowledge just when it's about to completely fade away. That's the most powerful time to reactivate it. And you can reactivate in several ways. You can give another example, you can give another concept or model, or you can provide another practice. And of course, another practice is best, or a little combination of each. But then they can be small and distributed over time. So, and that matches the way our brain works, because we can only strengthen the connections between ideas, which is really what learning is strengthening connections between neurons. You can only strengthen it so much in any one day before the strengthening function fatigues. And we literally need sleep before we can strengthen it some more. So we need to reactivate over time. We have robust results about that. Mobile provides a more accessible way to do that because it's the device that's with you all the time.
mhm,
I asked, the only device people take with them everywhere is their phone. They have tablets. They believe if they're just going shopping, and their desktop, their laptop, they only take if they're going on a trip.
mhm.
But imagine going to a party or to the store without your phone. You'd go through withdrawals, right? You'd be shaking, going, "Oh, I need my phone." So that's my point: is that do good learning and then take advantage of what unique mobile operates, and that to me is what a good M-learning program is.
So mobile learning is a way of delivery, but the main content is still king. So in your words, it's still, it needs a basic structure or a model, and then the context and basic practices and the examples to do that. And then M learning is just a way to carry those messages or those contents. And
Indeed, and you can minimize it if people know a lot, so some of these language things, they play off the knowledge, so you can
mhm,
use, I don't know, Duolingo is an example I know here, and I don't know what's, the top one in China, but what it does is it just does little bits. It doesn't need a bunch of upfront because it's playing on your existing knowledge of your language, and then it's gradually dripping in. So if you have some prior knowledge, you can minimize the amount of content you need, and you can do largely little practices and little dribbles of content. But you
mhm.
need, again, the right basis upon which to build, and how well known that is. If you're a novice in something, you probably need a lot more than if you're a practitioner or an expert.
Mhm. Back to the four characteristics I'm labeling it right now. The four characteristics you mentioned earlier, the uh, the last one, contextual. We're still around the talking about the context. So
Mm.
just-in-time training. Just-in-time training. Do you think that one is like fit into this category? Because it's on the go. Just as you said, not everything. Especially in China. We're developing so fast. Most of the companies are fast developing because we're fast economy. Very few things are concrete and don't change and they're static. But everything's changing. So that's why the word VUCA, VUCA, is so popular in China. So it's like we're chasing our tails like a little cat all the time. We're busy. But based on what you said, you're saying is we should based on something and then have the right delivery method, which is probably right now is I'm learning is very important. And then you said, and then we can use it for performance support, for social interaction. Performance support is on the go, of course. And then contextual, just-in-time learning. I mean, just-in-time training. Does that fit in that also?
It depends. So
Mm-hmm.
many times, particularly when things are changing so fast that if you learned it, it would be out of date. It doesn't make sense to try and put it in the head, put it in the world, let you look it up. That to me is more performance support. So again,
That's
if
right.
the answer's in the network, connect them to the right person. If
That's
you
right.
can put the answer in the world, and particularly for things, large amounts of content,
Right.
arbitrary content, fast changing content, don't try and
Right.
put it in the head. Make it available. And a mobile device is a wonderful way to bring it to people, that information, so they can look it up, get going, and not have to remember it.
Mm-hmm.
The only things that could go in the head through a formal course are the things that you will need again and again, will exercise regularly, and are increasingly, I'll argue, they're cognitive skills. They're not knowledge, they're not information, they're the ability to make decisions about, how should I deal with this person? These, get the information, figure out how to use it in the moment. The using the information is what we need to put in the head. The information itself, particularly if it's dynamic, as you suggest China is, and I absolutely believe that, then put it in the world. Now, the contextual has to do with, can you bring something up because of when and where they are? Do you know they're visiting this customer? And so you should restrict the information to that specific thing. Do you know they're working on this particular piece of equipment so they don't have to search through all the different routers they're trying to maintain? You can tell them which one that is. It could be using a RFID tag, and it tells them what device it is so they can bring up the right information. You might even store it right there on the device, has its information about itself for your repairing it. But contextual has to do with because of when and where you are, because of your context. And that's harder, but it can be really powerful if you can take advantage of it in reasonable ways.
Mhm. So if we take advantage of it, and then we can do it on the go, we get the right content, for the right people, the right time, the right results, and then it can be called just-in-time learning.
Well, I still think of it as performance support, unless if I can give you the information so you can succeed with this task. You aren't
Right.
necessarily going to learn anything, particularly if it doesn't happen very frequently.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
would explicitly have to connect what I'm having you to do to a model that explains why we're doing it this way, and maybe a different example. We can do that, but by and large, we don't. And there may not be a good reason to, unless we need to develop your understanding over time about this. If it's seldom happens, but really important when you do, give them performance support and don't expect them to learn anything, because it's going to be gone by the next time. So
Right.
only focus on that extra layer. So, and I'm sorry, I'm being a pedant. This is the nature of being an ex-academic, but conceptual language, the conceptual labeling is really important to me, attaching the right thing. So it's not learning unless you're fundamentally changing the way I'll behave next time in the
Right.
same context. It's
Right.
just support so I succeed right now. And
Right.
that is because you design for them differently. And
Right. Right.
that's why I get upset with people who talk about microlearning. Microlearning can mean two things. It can mean spacing learning with little bits over time, and you actually do learn, or it can mean just helping you in the moment. but you design those totally differently. And if somebody comes, oh, we'll use microlearning. Well, which design approach, and is it the right one for what you're trying to do right now?
Right on, right on. Exactly. I think we're on the same spot. We're in the same. We're talking about the same thing. I differentiate. I just want to let you know that I differentiate based on the memory models and the what we learned. Their information and their knowledge. So I differentiate them. I define knowledge only those that can be stored as long-term memory, and then when you apply it, and then it will that are significant to the individual performer. So only only you meet those two characteristics, and those information can be labeled knowledge. Otherwise, those are informations. So information can be treated with like performance support, as you said, and then there are so many information, and then you use it, and then you forget about it. And next time you use it, and then forget about too. But if you repeat so many times, if it saves time, and then it's worthwhile to store it into your long-term memory through short-term memory process, and then repetition, and then the coding, and then into long-term memory, and then you remember it. So next time you don't have to look at it, and then that provides you with efficiency.
Right. Although repetition alone, that won't necessarily lead to it. You really need, you were talking about the connection. You need to connect it, elaborate it, and have a framework that explains it and connects it to your prior experience. And then, but that's worth doing if it will give you exactly what you said, the efficiency. If you want that efficiency, and it's not going to atrophy, and you can do this. Absolutely, that's what you need to make happen and can make happen. And I suggest there's times when it makes perfect sense.
Exactly. Just as you said just now, micro learning. Micro learning is so popular in China. Everybody's very odd, but I always tease my friends, and then they say, what you're doing is not micro learning, is micro information, is not learning, and they're not micro course, because there's no interactivities in there. There's just a simple display, one way, unilateral give away of information. So you see that information, and then that's it. So you don't process it into your brain and convert into knowledge. Maybe they're not useful, maybe that's not worth it, but the fact is you're not converting them into long-term memory, and then that's not knowledge, that's information. And there we have so many information around us.
Well, there is a situation where, because you're trying to solve this problem and the right piece of information answers it, gives you a model that allows you to make the right prediction and make the change. That's serendipitous moment, but that's really hard to engineer. And so I absolutely agree with you. That's why I try and make the distinction. And and by the way, both those interpretations of microlearning, the little bits of space learning, or the performance support in the moment, are both fabulously valuable. So I can understand the excitement, but be clear about which one you mean.
Right. Just be clear what you need, not doing microlearning for microlearning's sake,
Right, exactly.
And also, that's why in one of your chapters, you said unlearn is so important too.
No. I don't believe in unlearning. Because cognitively, we can't unlearn something. What we do is we have to learn over it. And again, I'm being pedantic, okay, I admit it, but I hate the people who say, the only future is the people who can learn, unlearn, and relearn. But the way our memory traces work, we will continue to trigger that. And the evidence is, you may think you've forgotten something, and then some smell or some sound will just bring back a memory you thought you completely lost. It's not gone. We pretty much believe we don't forget anything, but we can learn over it. We have to actually put ourselves in the same situation and practice doing something different until that's more likely than the old response. So I call it overlearning, which is slightly different than learning it so well that it's automatic, but it's kind of the same thing. But
I like that, overlearning. I really like it. This is my first time to hear it. I
Oh,
really
okay.
like it. It is the new memories and covers the old memories, and then and then replaces it or upgraded it. You know, is a reiteration of the old ways of doing things or old ways of doing of thinking or old information. I really like it.
Mhm.
This is good.
It's,
This is good. Yeah, this is good. Unlearn is not, yeah, but Unlearn was popular like even 20 years ago, and people at that time, because of the explosion of internet technology, there's so much information around us. So we need to be selective, and we need to kind of forget, forget some things, in order to have our brain more emptied out. But we only use like our brain 10%, 13% of our lifetime. So where the other 85% go?
no, that's a myth too. I'm sorry. You're triggering a bunch of my things.
I know,
My
I can see
my
that.
the most recent book is Millennials, Goldfish, and Other Training Misconceptions that covers a whole bunch of myths. And one of them is what you just said. Actually, maybe only 10% of our brain is active at any one point, but it's
Hmm.
because these patterns across the brain, it's sort of like your television screen. Some of it may be black and some of it may be colored. And but actually much more than 10% of our brain tends to be active at any one time. And it's the change. So it's not like this part's always active and none of this is working. It's the change across it. And
Right, right, right.
that's
Well,
um,
we'll come back to that goldfish book. I really like it. The myth, the 10% of it. I really like it. Yes, yes, the goldfish and the millennium and goldfish and the myth.
yep.
We'll come back to that because you did present some of the multitasking. I remember there's a multitasking, there are 10% thing, and so there's a lot of myths that so common that people use them almost daily, and also 10%, and also learning styles. Oh
Learning
gosh,
styles, generations, Dale's cone, the list goes on.
right,
16 misconceptions and then, no, myths, and then
right,
5 misconceptions, no, 16 more misconceptions, 5 superstitions identified. But anyways, numbers don't matter.
right.
It's just that they are still prevalent, and there's people who push them because they have a vested interest in doing it, and it's problematic.
Right, right. So under that context, if we have all these, if we are I'm learning program meets the four characteristics, and they're built under context and deliver the right for the right person at the right place, right time, and then based on context and 4 results. So that will prevent giggle, right? I mean, there's a word in e-learning like garbage in, garbage out, like, you know.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
what are the best ways to prevent that from happening?
well, the best way to present GIGO is not to have the GI. If you don't have garbage in, you don't have garbage out.
I like that.
The, it, it's so how do you not have garbage going in? And that's where
Right.
you stop taking orders for courses. Somebody says, I need a course on this. You go, okay, I'll do it.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, why? What's the problem? So performance consulting up front is so important to make sure, because there are a number of reasons why performance may not be happening appropriately. And it may not be knowledge in the head. It may be the incentives, or maybe the tools or resources aren't available. So you
Right.
want, what performance consulting does, it says, what's the root problem? What is
Mhm.
really wrong? And you
Mhm.
say, and you really should be asking, how do we know? And how will we know when it's fixed? So that's, what is the measure that's below what it should be, and what should it be? And when it's there, we'll know we're done. And then you say, what's the root cause of that root problem?
Mhm.
And there's a number of different things that could be. It's a gap analysis. What's the cause of the gap? What's the gap? And then what's the root cause of the gap?
Mhm.
And so you do that and make sure you've identified the right problem, and then
Mhm.
you apply the right solution. And it may be a course, it
Mhm.
may be a job aid, it may be a increase in supplies, it may be change in what they're rewarded for or how they're recognized. There's a bunch of tools at our disposal to influence performance. So you start there. That's the first prevent ego, is you don't make sure you're addressing the right problem. And then for each of those problems, you do the right design. And particularly for courses, this comes down to understanding, how to motivate people up front and stuff I've talked about before, having the right explanatory models, and none but the right explanatory models. So no extra stuff. We don't want to overload cognitive load. We want to have the right examples that span enough space, will get appropriate transfer. We absolutely need the right practice to start slow and gradually build our capability until we're capable here. So it's performance consulting up front, and then what I like to think of as learning experience design. And by that, I mean the elegant integration of learning science and engagement to create an experience that's both effective in achieving the outcome and engaging in terms of the learner gets it. And I don't mean trivial fun. That's a bad concept. But instead, what Seymour Papert once called hard fun. And that's where it's challenging enough that you're struggling, but you get that release when you achieve it. And it's not too difficult to be frustrating. It's not too easy to be boring. It's at that right level of challenge. And you manage that throughout the process. There's a bunch more that goes into this, but that's really, to me, make sure you're applying the right solution, and then do the solution right. If job aid, it's appropriate information design. For courses, it's learning experience design. For incentives, it's an area I don't want to get into. But
right, absolutely. I do want to move on a little bit from away from I'm learning, because we spent a big chunk of the time on I'm learning, which is very, very important and interesting topic, especially here in China. I know it's very popular in America as well. But next, I want to talk about a little bit about shift gears to learning strategy and delivery. You also wrote books on learning strategy and delivery. And right now, at the beginning of the year, a lot of organizations are making, learning strategies, performance or capability development, capability management strategies for the year, or for the next 2 years, or for the next 3 years. So my question is to you: how do we transform learning and development practices to make learning practices more relevant and meaningful to organizational goals?
Well, I don't know what it's like in China, but here in the US, I have sort of a cheeky saying that L&D isn't doing near what it could and should, and what it is doing, it's doing badly. Other than that, it's fine.
That is agreed. Totally.
So,
both sides.
right. So what we were just talking about, not having garbage in, garbage out, that's about
Right.
what we're doing badly. We're not applying learning science. We're not applying performance consulting. My solution to that, the step you should take for that, is start measuring your impact, not your efficiency. In the US and in a lot of the Western world, we measure how much does it cost to have a bum in a seat for an hour. And we don't ask the important question: is that bum in that seat for an hour having a useful impact on the business? The first one's measuring efficiency. What we need to do is measure impact. And that goes back to what I said about performance consulting. How will we know when we fix the problem? What are you shooting for as appropriate level? What is this level now, and why isn't that appropriate, and what should it be? And then we ask, how do we get there? So if we started measuring impact, and this is hard in many organizations because it takes going beyond L&D. You have to actually talk to the business unit and find their measures and work with their measures, and crossing those silos is challenging. But yet, if we did that, if we started measuring our impact, we would begin to know what we're doing isn't appropriate, or is, but by and large, the evidence is it isn't. And that would trigger us to improve our game. So that's what we are doing, we're doing badly. Now, the other part is I have this bigger agenda for L&D. Right now, we're seen as sort of this order taker, this appendix that's, necessary in the good times, but in the bad times, we should get rid of it because it's expensive and, doesn't even justify how it's doing. And yet, one of the critical things, and this goes back to what's the state of business, and your VUCA, which I absolutely agree with, is the world is becoming more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So what we need, optimal execution, courses and performance support is about the stuff you know you need to. And but that's only the cost of entry going forward. For your organizations in China, what's going to be the differentiator is going to be continual innovation. This is true for organizations around the world. Continual innovation. Where does that come from? Well, I want to suggest that when you're doing troubleshooting and problem solving, when you're doing research and design, you don't know the answer when you start. That's why you're doing these. So that means they are learning. However, they're not formal learning, because they're formal learning, somebody knows the answer we want to bring everybody up to. Here we're doing the informal learning. And that needs facilitation to be optimal. We have a lot of results about what makes effective informal learning and what interferes.
Mm-hmm.
To me, L&D should be the group that understands most about learning, period, and therefore should be the people to lead this. And here's the win. If they do, if they are the ones that take forward, turning into the engine of innovation in an organization, they have suddenly moved from the periphery to the most central role possible in an organization, the driver of future success. So when I say that L&D isn't doing near what it could and should do, it should be owning that whole aspect of innovation. And to do that, so the first step to take to improve what we are doing is measurement, to make sure we are actually succeeding. The second part is to first apply those practices internal to L&D. L&D has to be the ones who start experimenting and explicitly having time for experimenting and looking at the results of the experimentation and trying new things and doing things like working out loud, sharing what your progress is and what your process is so others can look at it, critique it, improve it, creating a safe culture in which to do that, which is really challenging. But if L&D starts doing it internally, begins to understand it, begins to own it, then they're credible when they want to take it to the rest of the organization. So back to your very first question, how do we transform L&D practices? We start measuring and we start practicing informal learning practices internally and get ownership of it. From there, we have a solid basis to start improving what we're doing of the things we already are doing and start improving the rest of the organization and what it can be doing. And that to me is a really powerful opportunity that awaits us.
I totally agree that we're far below what L&D, I mean, currently L&D the position should be in organizations. They are the owner of the capability management and capability development for an organization, and they are the owner of it. They're accountable, and they should do what they are set up to do. Otherwise, any forms of, in China, corporate universities are very popular. Training centers, they're all called or management colleges, and but they always have a prefix which is the company's name, like Motorola University. It's so common and it's so popular now, but right now people just pay more attention to the formality or to the form, to the format than the content itself. That's why content is king is so important. The accountability of learn L&D is so important, and because we have to start from the very end. L&D has to start. I absolutely agree. The measurement. If we can't measure, and also when I interviewed Jack Phillips and Patty Phillips, they also
of course
emphasize that too.
Of course they would. That's what they do. Yeah.
Exactly. And next question is so much fun. And you published this book just now. You showed us the millennials, goldfish, and other training misconceptions. And I just cite a few. And then will you please give us a few more? Just pick a few more interesting and explain to us. One is training should be tailored to individual learning styles. We only use 10% of our brain, and multitasking is as simple as different as flipping a switch. etc., etc. What are the other like 13 myths?
Well, let's see.
I don't want
Dale's
you to each
cone is
one of
one.
them, but
Right. Well, I don't know if you want me to explain a few or if you want me to tell you a whole bunch of the myths that exist.
a
I
whole
got
bunch of them,
you
and then yeah, a whole bunch
right.
of them,
Okay.
and then tell us, and then yeah,
So there's sort of the
for the merrier.
generations or the millennials is one that, people are different by this sort of category of when they grew up.
Right.
Um, Dale's cone is one, that pyramid that says, oh, you remember 10% of what you read and 30% of what you hear and 100% of what you teach. That's another one. Left brain, right brain, uh, male, female brains. Uh, I'm digging deep. That neuro-linguistic programming. There are a
NLP.
bunch of, yeah.
Yep.
There's another NLP, which is natural language processing, which is a really
Right.
important
Right.
area of
Right.
research. But the neuro-linguistic programming NLP is been discredited robustly, and so I can't remember them all. I'd have to look them up, and I don't want to take time. But there's 16 of them, all told, that were just the ones that I identified for the book, and not necessarily all the ones that are running around. There'll be new ones. There will be.
You just now explained to us we only use 10% of brain, and can you tell us why learning styles is also a myth?
Okay. Well, it's really appealing. And that's what I try to do in the book is explain the appeal first and then talk about why it's wrong and then give you a useful alternative. So the appeal, anybody who's ever taught recognizes that learners differ, right? And it's really appealing to say, if we can identify how learners differ, then we can help them in their own unique way. And that sounds really appealing. There are two problems with this. And the first one is when they do the studies of customizing learning to how either learners think they learn best or are tested to learn best on an instrument, there's no benefit to that. There's no benefit to teach people in their preferred way. And I'll explain that in a minute. But the second problem is, can we, how they test on an instrument. The problem is there haven't been any reliable instruments. So, by the way, a blue ribbon panel looked at, and it's been replicated twice now, at least. They looked at a whole bunch of studies comparing training people to their style and finding out that there was no result. So there was a blue ribbon panel that did a meta-analysis studies, and that's been robustly demonstrated and repeated. Another blue ribbon panel looked at all the instruments to identify how you learn what your style is, and they found 71. And they picked a representative 13 that sort of characterized all the different ones they had. And they tested it. And by the way, that includes Myers-Briggs. And they found that they were not psychometrically valid. They had 4 measures of psychometric validity. And that's like, is it reliable? Does it, if you test it and test people later, is it still the same? Is it valid? Do they test independent things? Do they test what they say they test? And they found out that there was actually one that passed all 4 tests, but it was pretty uninteresting. It was one dimension. Are you, field dependent or independent? Doesn't really have a lot of use. So you can't reliably identify it, and there's no benefit to teaching to it anyways. It turns out, so what are you supposed to do? It turns out the best way to design your teaching is for your teaching outcome. In fact, what you said, the right outcome. Use the right teaching method for the outcome. So we have alternatives. Teaching somebody to use a projector is very different than teaching somebody to do negotiation. They're vastly different, and we have vastly different methods. But it's not about teaching styles or learning styles. It's about what do you need to learn, and let's adapt to that.
Thank you. Why multitasking isn't efficient? Because a lot of companies, especially at the call centers across all the globe, we're teaching them to multitask. Well, you're doing this, you're on the phone with a customer, and then you do this, and this is trying to find information and switch between screens to trying to find the right information to get the right answer to your customers. But is that efficient?
Well, that to me isn't multitasking. So they've got one task to help this customer. They may have to go here to look for this information, here this information. That's problematic. because you're getting cognitive load by having to shift, not having it in one place.
Right.
But multitasking is really, and I think I hear this on call centers as well. They're sort of, I type in something and I wait, and then finally I get a response to them, and I think they're jumping to another customer's chat and dealing with that customer's question, and they're jumping back and forth. That to me is true multitasking. And here's the problem. Although our brains are parallel at the subsymbolic level, at the subconscious level, at the conscious level, working memory, which is where the type of active problem solving we do happens, we are serial. In other words, I solve this. And then if we switch, we have to do what you do in a computer. We have to save the context, bring in the other context, regenerate what we are doing, and continue. And then when we switch back, we have to save this status and put it away and bring in this other status and regenerate. And all that extra overhead interferes. It slows you down. And we have reliable results that show that when you try and multitask, you perform less accurately and less fast than if you don't. So and fortunately, the computing metaphor works really well, Hill, for explaining it. It's just that we are serial at the conscious level, and we have to regenerate the state that we were in before on the new task. On the task we just switched to, we have to regenerate it so we knew what to do next, and that takes time.
That's why focus is so hard sometimes for some people, and also meditating on one subject for over a long time is so important, because only in that, well, Steve Jobs is a Buddhist, and he meditated a lot, and then he came up with this genius innovations. And
well, so, even time for reflection. You need time for reflection. Amy Edmondson and her, with her colleague Garvin and Gino, talked about the dimensions of learning culture, and they identified 4 major environmental factors, and that's not just tolerance, but appreciation of diversity, open-mindedness to new ideas, psychological safety, and time for reflection. And it's that time for reflection, which can be for meditation or jogging or taking a shower, whatever you have that time to let the background percolation happen, is when you solve problems. I'll put a question in my mind before I'll go out for a walk, and I'll pretty much guaranteed by the time I come back, I've got the answer. So, right. But you triggered one other memory of one other misconception. That's because it's related. It's that 8-second attention span, that we have the attention span of a goldfish. And that was a misinterpretation of data from another thing. But you're right, we have more distractions now. It's not that our attention span is decreased. We have more distractions, and we are smarter about distracting attention with all the marketing tricks that we know about flashing things in the periphery and flashing up salacious headlines or whatever it is. So there are more distractions. And for learning design, it's really important to remove those distractions, help learners focus so that you can get exactly what you're talking about, George, that intense focus to actually process the information and make those connections, allow that learning strengthening to happen.
Great. So with that, where do you predict the science of learning is headed in the future? And then we talk about cognitive load and cognitivism and so many things, and they're all learning science. I mean, science, psychology pertain to learning. So in the future, will learning development still exist? Implant. You said you don't like that, but well,
no.
So what's your take on that?
I think it turns out learning science is relatively new. We've been studying school psychology since late 1800s. We've been looking, instructional design started at the end of World War II or during World War II. But in the 90s, cognitive science field and a bunch of people were wanting to pull people together from the disparate fields to consolidate the information they have. And they created the Society for the Learning Sciences, and they had a journal and they had a conference, and that sort of created the field. And they started creating a unified body of understanding that starts from cognitive science and includes educational psych and instructional design, a bunch of other things.
Right.
They are continuing to research and unpack things. There are some fabulous results. We know, we've already mentioned the spacing of learning and interleaving learning, and deliberate difficulty, and there's a bunch of robust results that really give us guidance for designing learning. That's going to continue. They're going to unpack more nuances about how does that change in different contexts? How does that change on different domains? What are the optimal ways to use different technologies? The one thing I'm excited about, and because this is part of my two directions, I went back to sort of my LXD roots, and I was going to cover both of them. And then ATD asked me, as the subsequent book to the Myths book, my next book coming out in April was on learning science. And I've actually written a Reader's Digest condensed version to make learning science accessible. So I think that stuff is going to continue in a sensible way. But the part I'm really excited about is beginning to really look into the emotional aspects of it. That started. There are some robust results coming out there. I think that's much more to unpack about motivation and anxiety and humor and how all these get put together into a coherent package. How do you not just grab attention in the moment? How do you not just create a good practice, but how do you create an experience with trajectories of emotion, with a, motivation starts high and stays high? How do you keep anxiety low? How do you build confidence? So that's the part I think we're seeing more of in learning science, and I'm really excited about what the outputs of that can give us to combine with the increasing results on the more cognitive side. So it's, enriching the cognitive side and adding in the emotional side of the directions I see.
I'm really interested because the term learning science is not very widely used, even though it's been there for a long time, but it's not used. Talked about or written about very much. But you're actually writing a book on it, and so when will that book be published?
In April. It's coming out through ATD Press, and it's
right.
There have been books. So I recently had a diagram and a talk about how in 2003 Ruth Clark came out with her e-learning and the science of instruction. Then 2006 they did a subsequent book, and then in 2012 Julie Dirksen's Design for How People Learn. But suddenly there's more and more. Two books just this past year, Miriam Nealon and Paul Kirshner's evidence-based, evidence-informed learning design, and Ruth Clark came up with another one about evidence-based training methods, and Elaine Beach in 2016. So there's came out with the art and science of training. There's an increase in books about the evidential base, the empirical base, the scientific and theoretical base behind good instructional design and good learning. And that is really promising and really important.
Right. The more and more from the titles, and I always I have a saying in Chinese. It's 10 characters, but in English it says training is a science, instruction is an art. Training is, I've been saying this for any credit, but I was saying this for like almost 20 years, about 20 years now. So training is a science because at that time when I was a kid, I learned, oh gosh, this is psychology, this is Gane, this is a big nine, and then they're all science. They're all scientists, psychological scientists. And then it's more objective. Instruction is art, is a different forms of delivery in classroom. And then that's why it's more subjective. It depends on your own, based on your own experience, your personal presentation style, something like that. So it's more kind of the yin-yang principle. One is this, one is that. One is more objective, the other is subjective, then make a unity. So it's two opposite things, and they form a unity. And one is a science and one is an art. Because in art, there's no correct answers, but in science, there are correct answers because of their subjectivity.
Well, I will, that may have been the case. I would argue that we have good science for instruction and good science for training, but we want to add the art in for that creativity and emotional engagement. But there is science behind that as well. But there's also the art of, we could pick any one of these three settings to do this that makes it fun. And it could be in space, it could be in the Wild West, it could be in medieval times. We can set the learning in any one of these three. And that's the art part of it, is choosing the right one. But then the science is, how do you ensure that the tasks they're making in that setting are still the ones they need, that are the right practice activity? And as we move instruction from content presentation and knowledge to skills, and I think we should, I think too much of university has been learn all this stuff, but never use it to do anything. And now I'm getting out on my editorial soapbox, so I'll step down. But I think training could have more layers of models behind it instead of just rote, and instruction can be a little bit more practical. And I think that's to the benefit of everybody.
Right. Thank you. So the next important question is, 70-20-10 rule is so important in China, so popular in China. Is that correct? Is that also a myth?
No, when I addressed it, I called it a misconception. Misconceptions are things that some people really strongly support and some people hate. So it's not a myth in that it's debunked. It's that some people interpret it one way and some people interpret the other way. And what I tried to do in that section for those was tell you when it makes sense for you or who it makes sense for. So 70-20-10 is that notion that, we learn 10% from formal learning, 20% from social learning, and 70% on our own. And that came from asking some executives how they did what they did, and then they trimmed away things that nobody could intervene in, and they were left with this rough ratio. And they smoothed it out because they wanted to emphasize the concept, not the exact data. So Charles Jennings is a colleague, and he's been taking that around and very successfully using it in organizations to get executives to recognize that once you've done a course, you're not done. That you then need to have the managers continuing to support that behavior and maybe some coaching to improve it over time, and then giving people stretch assignments so they can practice it and go beyond. So there's a lot that goes into it. Now, the other side is that people rightly criticize it. They say, oh, the numbers aren't perfect and this isn't real data. And that's true, it's been synthesized. So what I said in the book is, if you have support for doing coaching and mentoring and stretch assignments and getting the management involved in carrying on the courses beyond, you don't need it. But if you need leverage to help you carry that message to your executives to stop thinking of you as just give us a course and that and we're done, then use it. Now it's been confounded. Charles joined up with Yas Aris and Vivian Heinen and created the 70-20-10 Institute, which is actually doing the book they came out about is really a whole performance consulting methodology. And that's fabulous, but it just confounds the whole 70-20-10 message. And in fact, they're changing the name of the 70-20-10 Institute to Tulsar, which is the name of Yas and Vivian's company, which is result backwards. So 70-20-10 is useful for some people. It's not useful and vilified by other people. Use it if it makes sense, but it's a handy, accessible, useful way to get certain people to recognize how their own learning. If you ask somebody, if you have a sport or a hobby or something you do, a craft, how did you learn it? You're lucky if you spent 10% of your time actually taking formal courses about it. And instead you go do it with other people and you observe people doing it in videos, and it's not formal at all. So that's the message.
But corporate settings. So basically 70-20-10 rule is not science.
It was based in a scientific study. So they literally got a bunch of executives in different areas to come together and talk about and identify how much of what they'd learned to do to be good executives came from these different areas. Well, they asked them, how did you learn to do it? And they took it all, and then they allotted times to it, but they did filter out all the stuff that nobody could intervene. So they said, what could L&D actually do? They took away all that stuff. And then they looked at it and said, and it was roughly 70-20-10. It was, I forget, 69 and 30, 23 and 7 or whatever it was. And they just rounded it up. So it came from real empirical data, but it's been simplified for the purposes of actually making inroads in the way executives think about it. And by the way, it doesn't mean you allocate your financial resources that way. You don't put 70% of your budget on the 70%. That's not what it's about. It's about just recognizing where your development input comes. And I talk about this another way. I have a diagram where I talk about the value of formal learning falls off as you move
Right.
from novice to practitioner to expert. And the value of informal learning kicks in. When you're novice, you need formal learning. You don't know what you need to know and don't know why it's important. But then when you become a practitioner, you begin to know what you need to know and you just need it. And that's where
Right.
you start moving to performance support and self-learning resources. And when you're an expert, nobody can tell you what you need to know because you're the expert. You pass it on to other people. What you need are other experts to interact with to further advance your shared understanding and move things forward. So that's just another way of saying in many ways the same thing. Does
Right.
that help?
Absolutely. I know you're running short a little bit on time, but how do you how the pandemic impact our field? That's
Well,
my
it's interesting. It, there's the short-term answer and the long-term answer. The short-term
right.
answer was everybody panicked. When it happened, I was going, let's use this as an inflection point. Let's use it as an opportunity to rethink what we're doing. Nobody
Mhm.
wanted to do that. That message fell on deaf ears. Everybody was just panicking and saying, how do we get up? How do we buy a virtual instruction platform? How do we transfer everything?
Mhm.
Now, so the short-term answer is we just put everything online. The long-term answer is we have a chance to rethink now and start saying, what really happens? We found out a number of things. We found out that you can trust people to work virtually, that
Mhm.
if you create the right environment, people will still work and don't have to be micromanaged and
Mhm.
walked around and observed. So we're finding out what really works, what's really important to make people work effectively, regardless of context. And that's
Mhm.
stuff that's been known, but it hasn't been put into practice. Just those four things I mentioned, appreciation of diversity, open mind, psychological safety. In the US, we have something called the Miranda Law, where if you're pulled over by the police, they have to warn you. Anything you say can and will be held against you. Well,
Right.
there's organizations that run like that anything you say can and will be held against you. Nobody's going to share their best ideas. You're not going to get the innovation there. So
Mhm.
I think we're finding out that if we work in a way that's better aligned with our innate human nature, with how we think, work, and learn, we get better outcomes. We get happier people, and the output of what they do is better. That's what we've learned. What we now have to do is go back and figure out, what does that mean we should be doing? And that's the environment I'm really excited about. I'm giving a talk about that next week that says, what taking what we know about how we think, what does that mean how we should support thinking online? What we take about what we know about how we work, and by there I mean social, what does that mean? So I think this is the challenge we have and the opportunity we have that goes along with that, going beyond just the course. Doing the course different, but
Mhm.
doing it in alignment with the ways we work best, because that's what I take as the biggest lesson from COVID, is that when we find out how to do things in the most humane way, we get the best outcomes. And now we need to figure out what that means for everything we do.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Uh, uh, second last question. If you had a chance to start all over again, what would you have done differently?
Not much. I'm very fortunate. I saw the connection between computers and learning as an undergraduate, as I mentioned, and
Right.
that's been my career ever since. And it's my passion.
Mhm.
It's my avocation as well as my vocation. And I like to joke, it's what I would be doing if I were independently wealthy, and you're welcome to make that happen. But um, uh, the one thing that's probably held me back as an independent consultant since leaving the time, I don't know. I've struggled to be smart about the business side of it, the negotiation, the selling conversation. I do decent marketing,
Mhm.
but I haven't spent enough effort. If I do it again, I would, and maybe this is the notions to your audience of
Mhm.
upcoming L&D practitioners, make sure you know the business, what it's important, what matters there as well.
Mhm. Yeah, that comes to the last question. As a closing statement, do you have any advice to the young practitioners in China and developing countries as a whole?
Yeah. Well, it comes from what we've been talking about. First,
Right.
keep learning, stay curious, my friends. That's the most important thing. And then that means make sure you have a good, solid grounding in learning science. It's not just because, you're not going to be expected to write whole instructional design principles yourself. They exist, but they have gaps. And when you fit the gaps, you need that basis. And new people are going to come and push new things and new myths. And some of it will be good and some of it will be myths. And how do you distinguish between it? So you need the learning science, the cognition and the learning science. And then also understand what makes us care, the engagement side, the emotional side, the social side, and the cultural side. What makes an environment in which people learn their best, what makes an environment where people can ask questions and actually get answers and give answers in a way that anybody will pay attention to them. And so that is the solid conceptual basis. And then, make sure you know the business, you're being relevant. And that gets back to the measurement and trying it out internally, and then knowing that strategically the way to spread it is to own it credibly yourself. Yeah, I hope that helps.
So learn, keep learning, and keep finding the gaps and fill them and meet the new challenges and know the business.
Yeah.
Thank
Pretty
you.
much so.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Clark. Thank you so much for, I really, it's a really short 1 hour and 10 minutes an interview, but I really learned a lot. And those questions are really loaded questions, but you gave us a very, this is a great, worthy discussion. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I love these discussions, and I hope maybe they will lead to some positive change for us. I wish you all the best. I wish you and your audience the best of luck in trying to make the world a better place.
Thank you. And stay safe and stay tuned. And goodbye. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
That's my interview with Dr. Clark Quinn. How do you feel? I feel very fruitful. I mean, I learned a lot from him, because during our interview, we not only covered the topic of I'm learning, he also mentioned, he also provide some clarification about some of the most often misconceptions, including the 70-20-10 rule, including NLP, including micro-learning, etc., etc. And all those misconceptions or myths are debunked in one of his books called the Millennium and the Goldfishes, and those and other myths in training. So that book is very interesting. It's going to be a very good read. Thank you, Dr. Clark Quinn, for your years of contribution to this field. And we expect to learn from you in the future more. And thank you for all of your practical research in the field, because your findings are very, very practical. It will save us a lot of time for finding those correct answers. Thanks again. Next week, we are going to switch gear a little bit. We are going to move into more practical in the next few sessions. We're going to, in the next few episodes, we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to move into more pragmatic sessions. So next week, starting next week, we're going to have Alex Salas. He's a very energetic and innovative instructor and researcher in this field. In the next week, March 10th, on the 41st episode, we're going to ask him a lot of questions around how to use internet to foster very competent instructional designers. What are some of the innovative ideas applying today's internet technology, especially the virtual technologies, to solve learning and development problems? And also, we're also going to ask him a special term called the Chief of Awesomeness. Chief Awesomeness. So what is the Chief of Awesomeness? Let's hear from him, his explanation or his definition. So until next week, please stay safe, stay tuned. Thank you, and good night.